Hello there, beautiful people. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm not gonna do my usual non-funny shitposty stuff and try my best to bring you guys some important information that I think you guys would find useful. Now, essentially the topic is about research. It's a little nerdy and a little boring. I'm gonna try my best to not make it as boring as it is, but bear with me, it is a little geeky. Anyways, so the topic that I want to talk to you guys about today is research. If you are looking at a particular research or a particular development in the field of, let's say, physics, applied physics, chemistry or applied chemistry, even biology or applied biology, what I'm about to say might not be relevant. But if you're looking at particular development in any of the social sciences, political sciences, or even scientific disciplines like pharmacy, to some extent medicine, although you can make the argument that applied biology falls very closely within medicine. I understand, getting into a little bit of gray areas there. And anything related to policy prescriptions. What I am about to say is very relevant, and I really want you guys to think about this the next time you watch or listen to some form of a development in a particular discipline, especially when it talks about policy prescriptions. Now, there are two things that we need to be mindful of. A lot of you guys have heard of the criticism of a particular research or researcher. A criticism along the line that the sample size is too small. It only looks at 12 people or 15 people or 18 people, and that's not big enough. That's not a big enough sample for us to make general descriptions or prescriptions of the population. And a lot of those times, those criticisms are valid. But a common question you guys might have wondered is, what is a large enough sample size? Is a sample size of 100 participants large enough for you to make prescriptions about a bigger population, much bigger population? Is a sample size of 500 big enough for you to make those claims? Well, for those of you familiar with statistics, you know that you would be able to make tests. You'd be able to make tests on your hypotheses if the sample size is 30 or more. For people who are not familiar with statistics, when I say tests, what I mean is stuff like this. If I want to make the claim that pursuing a particular policy increases productivity by whatever percent, there are actual mathematical tests that I can do to actually quantifiably prove that to my readers. And generally those tests rely on a certain amount of sample, and that sample needs to have particular properties. So generally, if a study includes around 30 people, or 30 people at the least, we can say that, okay, that sample size that'll give us some idea as to what we're talking about. That number is very specific, and it comes from a very specific set of properties. Usually when you have a research that has a sample size of 30 people, most people will generally ignore it. And the reason people will ignore it is because when we say 30 people is enough, we're making some very strong assumptions. The assumption that we're making is, this is not a self-selected sample. What do I mean by a self-selected sample? If your research predominantly consists of people who all share some common characteristic, and that common characteristic is why they chose to participate in your research, you have a little bit of a problem. What do I mean by that? Let's say you are investigating whether a particular policy has improved job satisfaction, and you ask people to sign up for your research. And the only people who sign up for your research are people who are really happy with the company. In that case, that's going to skew your research. In other words, you're not getting a random sample. If you look at an example that applies in real life, for people that teach, a lot of the times they feel that they've done a really good job teaching because a lot of people come up to them after class saying, hey, I really liked your class, you've really changed my life, so on and so forth. And these professors end up believing that they're doing a really good job. Come teacher's evaluation day, and they see their evaluations are much worse than they expected. And that's because the only people they got their feedback from are people that like them. So that's an example of self-selected sample. Now, the other important thing that you need to understand is, especially when we're talking about some form of policy description, there needs to be a control group and there needs to be a treatment group. For people unfamiliar with these things, a treatment group and a control group are two separate groups that can be differentiated based on whether a policy is tried out on them. These two groups have to be identical in every other aspect with the exception of the policy. So for example, if I want to investigate whether chocolate milk increases your productivity or not, I have to take two groups of people that are of equal IQ, that are of equal socioeconomic background, that are of equal upbringing, that are of equal educational training, and I make one group drink chocolate milk X amounts of time a day, and I make the other group not drink it. Only then can I make some form of educated statements about the impact of chocolate milk. I hope I could somewhat make this clear. So essentially, to summarize this long epic rant, when you're looking at a particular research, two things you have to keep in mind. Sample size, whether it's a self-selected sample or not. The opposite of a self-selected sample, the sample we actually want, is a randomly generated sample. For people not familiar, a randomly generated sample is our best case scenario. To understand what it is, think about if all the people that you're possibly interested in for your study had their names written down on a piece of paper and you put it in a hat. And you closed your eyes and randomly picked names out of the hat without any form of inclination towards anything whatsoever. The sample that you would select under that perfect scenario is a randomly generated sample. And for our research, we want to be as close to that as we possibly can. A lot of the times we can't, and therefore we try to increase our sample size much larger numbers than 30. And the other thing that you need to worry about is there a clearly defined treatment group and control group, and are the treatment and control group identical along other respects outside our main policy of consideration? That has to be important. The reason why I talk to you guys about this insanely boring stuff today is because one particular avenue of research is permeating across the media landscape, and not just the media landscape, the academic landscape as well. And there are academic institutions, for example, the American Psychological Association, that is bending the knee to activists, to these fringe minority group of people that can do them a lot of damage with regards to publicity, advertising, and grants, and they're now bending the knee and really compromising the standards of research. And one of those things is transgender research. Transgender research has many criticisms. And the two criteria that I spoke to you guys about today earlier, they fail along both those lines. The sample size for the main transgender research that we are exposed to, at least in the media, is not big enough for most people to do any form of tests. Those hypotheses, more often than not, cannot be tested by those sample size alone. The other problem with most transgender research is that they're not randomly generated sample, they're a self-selected sample. So for example, when transgender doctors or physicians want to know the impact of a patient's well-being based on their policy, they self-select people that are happy about the treatment at that particular time, and they ask those people. So because of those two very important limitations, it's important that we educate ourselves on the sample size. A good resource, if you have a friend who's dealing with gender dysphoria, if you have parents, I think that's another important criteria, who's wondering about gender dysphoria, this site is very, very important. sexchangeregret.com. Now, as I've said, you can also make limitations about the methodology of people being demonstrated in this site. You totally can. But the idea is to get some form of an estimation of the greater sample size, because these stories are not represented by the mainstream media. So I think the main guy behind this site is Walt Heyer. He's the head honcho. In April 1983, I had Gender reassignment surgery. At first I was giddy for the fresh start, but hormones and sex change genital surgery couldn't solve the underlying issue. I detransitioned more than 25 years ago. So he's the principal character running the story. It cites some important documentaries, but these are just videos. Check them out. They're pretty important. But what's good about this site is that it gives you an idea of the latest round of medical research, research that is in its fledgling steps, not entirely out there, but it talks to you guys about it. And if you're interested, you can look at those studies in great details. And I've looked at them. They also highlight the limitations of the studies as well. So, for example, a University of Rome study proves that transsexuals have normal Y chromosomes. The SRY is the main sex-determining gene, genes of male fertility. The problem is, I have no training in biology, so I have no idea what these things mean. If you guys are trained in biology, you can sort of understand. But this site is very thorough and is very comprehensive in the materials it provides. As you can see, it cites articles that are somewhat easier to understand for people like me that have no training in biology. Their sources are pretty well cited. The sex change regret. Yes, these are pretty well cited things, at least from the few that I have read. You guys go through this and let me know. There's a lot of good resources for people looking to understand about stuff. As I said, I have no training in biology. I read through some of these, and I can to some extent understand what's going on. And yeah, so this is something particularly important. Now, remember when I was telling you guys about academia and the compromising standards of academia? There's another important thing that I forgot to mention that is of importance, which is academic citations. Citations are the most important thing in research, because if you are an independent person looking at a research, there's no better way for you to understand the existing literature than the citations. So for example, if I am engaged in a research where I am investigating the impact of, let's say, minimum wage on employment, let's say that's something that I'm investigating, my citations, whatever my research is, whatever my conclusion is, whatever my focus is, my citations would include all relevant research that I have looked into while engaged in my work. The relevant research that I looked into would include people whose hypotheses match up with mine, people whose results match up with mine, people whose hypotheses contradict mine, people whose hypotheses do not match up with mine, people that have conclusions much different than I did. All of these should be part of my citations list. Without that, if I don't include all of those things, have no use. That person looking at the citation cannot get a solid grasp of the existing literature that the question focuses on. Academic research with regards to transgender, I've gone into some of their citations, and they purposefully leave out the people that make criticisms, people that make valid criticisms about them. In other words, a lot of the transgender research is just junk science. If you have compromised citations, compromised sample study, and compromised the notion of treatment group and control group, it's useless. The research is useless. The only reason we call it research is because they have academic grants that they strong arm universities to give them, and that's essentially being used to poison your kids and parents. So this is really something, this is a really good resource to really counterbalance that narrative. And I suggest you guys take a look at it and pass it on to other people. Well, you guys, that's enough about this boring geeky talk. I will talk to you guys later. Take care.